Gather round as I tell you a tale of woe and misery, of personal failure and poor life choices. This is the story of how I failed as a computer science major. Now, I attended university during the mid to late 2000s, so a lot of stuff has likely changed since then, and since I'm recalling this from quite a ways back, we do need to keep in mind that human memory is notoriously fallible, prone to distortions, exaggerations, fabulations, and generally self-serving biases. Now, I want to emphasize that my failure as a computer science student was entirely on me. It was not the fault of my university, it was not the fault of my professors or the curriculum, it was not even the fault of Linux, despite how much I might complain about it. And I don't know how much relevance this will have to comp-sci students today, given how fast technology moves, but maybe if you're considering going into computer science, you might find this interesting or illuminating, or simply you can let my woe be your warning. So, a little bit of background. When I was in high school, I loved doing programming in my computer science classes. We were taught ancient, archaic languages like BASIC and Turbo Pascal, but the one defining memory was when I was in the 12th grade, our teacher gave us a snippet of Turbo Pascal code that would display a bitmap on the screen. And inside this code was something special. There, in bright pink text, was assembly language. I had never seen this before, but when I looked at it, I thought to myself, this is some kind of esoteric programming that, if I could master this, I would be a god amongst men. Anyway, I managed to wow my classmates by using this program to display this image of a Link from Super Smash Bros. Melee. Love that game. So, I thought to myself, hey, I like programming, right? Maybe I should major in computer science. The foolish delusion of a naive child! There were already problems on the horizon, because in high school and elementary school, I really hated math, and I really struggled with it. I never failed any classes or anything, but it always made me feel a great deal of anxiety being in math class. So, there I was, first year of university, intending to major in computer science, having some vague notion that I would like to get into the video game industry one day, because I like playing video games, so obviously making them must be fun. Right? Anyway, one of my friends suggested that it was my destiny to get hired by BioWare and start making RPGs, and this wasn't completely outside the realm of possibility. I mean, BioWare wasn't too far from where I lived. Now, there were 2 required classes in my first year. They were Introduction to Computer Science and Principles of Computer Science. We learned to program in Java and were taught basic principles such as variables, functions, and object-oriented programming. The degree program also required 2 semesters worth of math classes. They were Calculus 1 and Calculus 2. Calculus 1 was focused on differential calculus, and it was here that my troubles began. Our professor was this Ukrainian graduate student who was actually a part of the physics department, and while I'm sure he was obviously brilliant, his grasp of the English language wasn't great. He would, for example, refer to the X and Y axes as the X and Y axis, and it was only about halfway through the year that he finally learned that, yeah, we call it the X and Y axis in English. I didn't do too poorly in this class, mainly because I could coast on the knowledge of differential calculus that I had learned in high school. But then Calculus 2 came along and, oh boy, this was focused on integral calculus, and our professor was a Japanese man who once again was obviously brilliant but didn't have a very good grasp of English, and let me tell you, I struggled in this class. When I walked into that final exam, I had barely slept at all the previous night, and I was just this bundle of anxiety. Have you ever felt anxiety that is so intense that nothing around you feels real, like you're just a zombie sleepwalking through reality, that was me. And what grade did I get in this class? I got 50%. Exactly. And when I got that grade, I was hit by two emotions. One was relief that I had actually passed this class and wouldn't have to take it again. And the other was an overwhelming feeling of shame that I had got such a terrible grade in this class. So I did fairly well in my first year computer science classes, getting 93% in the first one and 88% in the second one, so not too shabby, and I even received an email inviting me to continue in the computer science program. So I met with my academic advisor, and he looked me over and said, "Yep, you should totally go for a second year of computer science. A lot of people struggle with the first year classes, but you obviously didn't, so go for it." So I did. And that's when my problems continued. You see, there was a class we had to take in the second year. It was called Programming Principles and Practice. According to the course description, it was supposed to be an introduction to imperative programming languages and scripting languages, programming practices, and tools and techniques for program development and maintenance. Now, you know that scene in Full Metal Jacket when Sergeant Hartman says that his job is to weed out all the non-hackers who don't pack the gear to serve in the Marine Corps? Well, this class had a reputation for being, well, a weed-out class. Would it surprise you to learn that I got weeded out? You see, something that was not hinted at in the course description was that this class would introduce my nemesis. That's right, this was when they sprung Linux on us. And as someone who had used Microsoft programs all his life, this was a real shock, let me tell you. And it didn't help matters that it seemed like my classmates were Linux prodigies who had been recompiling the Linux kernel since they were children and would often regale the professor with their tales of installing Linux on various machines. And I was just completely lost because the Linux system, the Linux architecture, and everything about it was completely foreign to me. And the one moment in this class that really sticks out in my memory is when I was at home and I read one of our assignments. It had something to do with shell scripting or string manipulation, and I was hit with a wave of anxiety and panic that was so intense that I wound up throwing up into the toilet. I had never experienced a level of anxiety like that before, not even in my math classes. And the other computer science classes, well, they were also stressful, but they were also mind-numbingly boring. One of them was based on data structures and software development. In practice, however, it was a continuation of object-oriented programming using a language called Eiffel. Now, I don't remember too much about Eiffel, other than that it was made by a guy named Bertrand Meyer, and that it used a lot of buzzwords like design by contract and high cohesion and loose coupling. Apparently, the reason that it was called Eiffel was because the Eiffel Tower was designed on budget and on time, and this programming language was designed to create software that was on time and on budget. The lectures were delivered by the professor in a continuous monotone, one long, incredibly unbroken sentence moving from topic to topic so that no one could interrupt. It was really quite hypnotic. The textbook, which was actually written by the professor himself, was this massive 1,000-page doorstopper filled with the densest, driest writing you could imagine. One of the subjects in this class was algorithm analysis, and that involved more, you guessed it, math. And believe me, I would rather shoot myself than have to read things like, for any function f that maps non-negative integers to non-negative real numbers, the set of functions that grows most as fast as f notated by O f of n and pronounced big constant c is given by done t times n equals function t, there exists constant c greater than 0 and x. There was another class we had, and our professor, well, he was the best way I could describe him was like the professor equivalent of Harlan Ellison. He was this sort of crotchety old curmudgeon, and if he liked you, he could be perfectly affable. But if he didn't like you, well, he'd do things like paying certain students to keep this other student out of the class because he didn't like them. And I think the one defining moment of this class was one day where the professor was walking around at the front of the lecture hall, and there was this table that had this cheap sort of plastic strips along the edge, and one of them had come loose with age. So as he walks by it, his coat catches on the end and sort of snaps it back. And so the professor looks down at this little piece of plastic siding, he grabs it, rips the entire thing off, and then looks at the class and shakes his finger and says, "Don't piss me off." That's basically all I remember from that class. Computer science was nothing but endlessly ping-ponging between horrifying anxiety and crushing boredom. And if I seem to be biased against Linux, because I am, it's because I just mentally associate it with one of the worst times in my life, with just horrible feelings all around. It's sort of like how, even now, I find the smell of butter and Coca-Cola to be disgusting because my first job was working in a movie theater and butter and Coca-Cola was what our garbage smelled like, so now I just associate that smell with garbage. Anyway, I began to notice that I was enjoying my other non-computer science classes a lot more, like German, for example. I loved my German class. I loved that political science class that was taught by some crazy guy from Texas. That was fun, that was interesting, that made me want to get up and go to class every morning. But my favorite class of all was Intro to Classical Mythology. It was taught in this old lecture theater that had been built all the way back in like the 1910s, and it was basically ancient Greek story time. And I remember how whenever the professor would begin describing some myth or some tale, we would all be counting down to the moment when he introduced a female character and said something like, "And then she attracted the attention of Zeus," because if you know anything about Greek myth, Zeus would sleep with practically anything that moved, and sometimes he wasn't even that discriminating. So, at the end of the year, I had had enough. I didn't want to do computer science anymore. It was obvious that I had been weighed, measured, and found wanting. So, what did I do instead? Well, I wound up doing 2 degrees in psychology and English, and I'm going to spend more time talking about English because it's more recent and I just tend to recall it more fondly. When I changed majors, it was like this huge burden had been lifted from my shoulders, that I didn't have to be this quivering ball of anxiety anymore. My classes were interesting, they were compelling. The professors were just cool people that I liked hanging out with, and yes, we did hang out with them. I remember one of my English professors who taught us a class on Beowulf and the Icelandic sagas. On the first day, he just invited us to his house out in the country. That was amazing. I had never had a professor like that before. And even now, many years later, some of my professors still recognize me when they see me in public. Like a few years ago, I was working at a library and I met one of my classical, medieval, and Renaissance professors who had taught us about medieval romances like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and he recognized me and we had a talk about the recent Green Knight movie. It was amazing. And a lot of times I find myself sort of nostalgically longing to be back in university again doing those classes. I really wish I could just do my English degree over, but with like different classes this time so I could learn more. Like if I had unlimited money and unlimited time, I'd basically just go back to university and take and get degrees in every single subject that I was interested in, which would not include things like computer science or math or engineering or anything like that, obviously. And then there are the people. Now, what I'm about to say may come across as being snide, condescending, or prejudiced, but a lot of computer science students, not all of them, I have to emphasize, but a lot of them have these terrible, toxic, and exhausting personality types. It seemed like they were the sort of people who were bullied relentlessly as children and never really got past it, so they became these vindictive and very bitter people who had wrapped their entire identity around this idea that they are intellectually superior, that having knowledge of computers meant that they had acquired an esoteric body of knowledge that the average person is too stupid to ever penetrate. There was this constant attitude that if you're good at programming, then obviously you are more logical and rational than the average person who is just some dumb monkey making emotionally based judgments about everything. They're the kind of people who generally try to act extremely cynical and jaded about everything, but also wind up being incredibly gullible because they simply think they're too smart to be fooled. They're the kind of people who assume that technical knowledge trumps all other forms of knowledge, and that because they have knowledge of one technical subject, they must therefore be experts in all subjects. Now, I have to emphasize, this does not describe all or even most computer science students. Most of them are just ordinary people, but my god, there were a lot of neckbeards in those computer science classes. That's not to say that I didn't have some neckbeard qualities of my own, of course. I was very, very deep into that whole new atheist, I am enlightened by my own intelligence bit, but that's the subject for another video. By contrast, the people in my English classes were just better people. They were more chill, more fun to hang around with. They had enough self-awareness not to dismiss entire academic fields as being useless just because they weren't personally interested in them. So, what can we learn from all this? Well, there are a few things. If you're considering going into computer science, then don't make the mistake that I did and assume that just because you enjoy programming as a hobby, that you will do well in computer science. Because computer science is about so much more than programming. It's about algorithm analysis, databases, software design, operating system, compilers, graph theory, ethics in computer science, human-computer interactions, and so much more. There's this quote, it's often attributed to Edgar Dijkstra, who apparently said something like, "Computer science is as much about computers as astronomy is about telescopes." Well, regardless if he ever actually said that, he was 100% correct. Secondly, how's your math? Computer science is inextricably linked with mathematics. There's no way of getting around it. And if you hate math, if you struggle with it, if it's something you find intolerably boring, you could very well end up struggling in computer science. And the third piece of advice is learn Linux. Before you even get to university, start learning Linux. Learning the Linux operating system, learning the Linux apps, the Linux command line interface. You need to, eat, sleep, and breathe it. It doesn't matter if you hate it, if you think it's the worst thing imaginable, learn it now rather than later. Don't let it be something that just gets sprung on you all of a sudden, because things move quickly in university, and your classes can't wait for you if you fall behind. And lastly, ask yourself if you really want to work in the tech industry. Could you imagine yourself sitting in front of a computer for 8 or more hours a day, staring at a bunch of code? Does that sound like an appealing career to you? I'm sure it does for some, but I wanted to work in the video game industry. Do you know what working conditions are like in the video game industry? It's not going to be 8 hours a day, let me tell you. I mean, I wanted to work for BioWare. Had I actually gotten hired by them, I would have started working right around when they got bought out by Electronic Arts and when they started going into full-on, soul-crushing crunch mode. If computer science hadn't broken me, I'm pretty sure that would have. And if you're still undecided on a university major, let me just tell you this. You'll hear a lot of people discussing which major is the hardest or the most stressful, but ultimately, how difficult a subject is, that depends on you. Because if you're interested in something, if you're passionate about something, then it might not feel difficult at all. I mean, I took an honors seminar about the Old Norse language, and I'm sure that a lot of people would say that learning this dead tongue with a rather complicated grammar would be hard. And yeah, I guess it was, but I was really interested in this subject, so it wasn't difficult or stressful at all. Anyway, I hope you found this video informative or, at the very least, entertaining. See you next time, everyone.